This is episode 154 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. And Wally, rarely will I say this, but this week has been an unusually entertaining week, at least if you're not driving up and down Central. In terms of the news, the hit count, as it were, for Albuquerque Rapid Transit is up to 5, but that could change between now and very, very shortly because they keep falling prey to the ART bus.
Yeah, so there's 20 buses. You need 16 for full service, and we've already had 5 wrecks. So if you go ahead and Google Albuquerque Rapid Transit accidents, you see first day accident, second, third, fourth, 5 accidents in so many days. I've had concerns about that before there were even buses on it because it's extremely confusing. Now, I will say that the city has their big campaign about what you should and shouldn't do and how it works, etc. And guess what? Not everyone pays attention to that. Also, people come in from out of town. You know, there are conventions when it comes to street and road design that are designed to where it works sort of pretty similar. We've decided, for example, to drive on the right side of the road in our country. In Great Britain, they drive on the left side of the road. So there's conventions, but this kind of two-way middle thing and these weird U-turns and you can't make left turns and all that. I think it's right there, if not beyond the border of going past the, in the words of Sheldon on Big Bang Theory, it goes beyond social convention and requires a little bit more knowledge than the typical driver's likely to possess.
And don't forget the odd signaling mechanisms because as my daughter aptly pointed out, I spent my first time on Central since ART got rolling over the weekend. We took in a play over at Popejoy, and that was made all the more exciting by the fact that the Twinkle Light Parade was earlier that evening, so there was a lot of traffic and parking issues over around campus. But my 9-year-old daughter, we were crossing over Central at Cornell to get onto UNM's campus to Popejoy, and she sees the white line on the street lights. There's actually a white line.
Yeah, what does that mean?
She says, why is there a white line there, Dad? What does that mean? I said, I have no idea. It's, I presume, just for the buses, but
hopefully the bus drivers know.
Yeah, well,
that's what your EKG would look like if a bus runs over you. Evidently, it'll just be the white line. But there have been some issues, and if it keeps up at this pace, it will be interesting to see what happens because it's not easy to sue governments for things like poor highway and road design. And to be honest, I was doing a little research. I couldn't get a definitive answer how easy or hard it is in New Mexico. But, if the injury and the body count gets high enough, courts tend to take a more expansive view about where liability resides, even with government entities. So.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And you mentioned body count. So far, we're at 5, I believe, just vehicle crashes.
Yeah, which are
problematic. Yeah. But yeah, if somebody dies or somebody's die in this whole ART fiasco, that is when things are going to get real. And you're right, the legal remedies or questions are many. But if one thing, there's one thing this area, this city, this state has in spades, it is ambulance chasing attorneys. You just need to look at a billboard in this town and compare. I think it would be a great little social experiment to go to other major cities and find out what percentage of the billboards are put up by ambulance chasers compared to Albuquerque. And I think Albuquerque's ambulance chasing billboard per capita is right at the very, very top nationwide. It seems like not just every other, but I'm talking 2/3, 3/4 of the billboards in this town are occupied by some kind of ambulance chaser, with the possible exception of casinos. And that was my other question was, when will the Santa Ana Star Center or the relevant sports books start putting odds down for how many ART crashes there will be in a given week. I think this is a fertile territory for some betting.
Yes, and not to make too light of this, but the only problem with your idea on the betting is we've had such a hard time recording crime statistics of any kind. We might not even be able to get that right. So maybe the over or under bet on art would be tough to fulfill from a casino point of view.
There you go. Well, many problems are there, and ART is definitely one of them. The idea of running buses in the center of a major road was always part of the concern, the question, as you rightly point out, about this ART project that just seems to be problematic at every single turn or straight lines not going so good.
Or converging straight lines that end up in a crash.
Yeah. Boy. And one of the worst, just by way of, we were also down at the Albuquerque Country Club for my wife's office party, and they're coming out of the Albuquerque Country Club, especially if you're going towards the west on Central. Since they redesigned that whole thing, it's a total disaster because you have people coming through who don't know that they're supposed to stop. You can't turn left coming off of that little road there where the country club is. You have to turn right and then flip a U-turn at some point, making sure that there's no buses, already vehicles, and U-turns are not the most desired of road maneuvers in general. So it's just, the whole thing was never sensible to begin with, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. And you're right. At what point does the number of wrecks happen that they have to, put the project on a shelf? A part of that is how many of these buses survive these crashes unscathed without having to be put out on the sidelines for repairs.
Yeah, exactly. So are the buses going to need to be euthanized at some point? And that takes away from the issue of the road. But, I know the place you're talking about, with regard to what's going on. And it reminds me of if you can figure that out quickly and easily. And I've struggled personally with that. It reminds me of like trying to drive while you're patting your head, you're rubbing your stomach, and you're texting while you're listening to the radio. There's just a lot going on there. And like I say, it's back to the convention. What would you normally do in traffic? And there's a lot of programming that goes into our brains from the time we take driver's ed, good, bad, or indifferent. There are patterns in our brains that get embedded. And it's tough to overcome those with a system like this. My idea, thinking about this issue for the podcast today, was there are a lot of simulators out there. And when you do things, design products, there's simulator racetracks. I think some of these configurations are going to need to be tested with simulators with people that haven't gotten it, so that what I believe is the inevitable need to redesign some of these places, they'll do it in such a way that might actually work. So,
and there's a great debate and discussion, and even a meme in libertarian circles about what about the roads, because libertarians, I think, make very cogent points across the political spectrum on a variety of issues, and the thing that always comes back at them is, oh, well, what about the roads? Because how can you possibly have roads without government? Well, we are seeing with the ART debacle that government doesn't do that great of a job with the roads. And I'm not going to say that the private sector can do all roads all the time absent government, but government doesn't do a great job. And it's not just things like ART, it's the stoplight situation in general, how long stoplights are and how they tie up traffic when you're just sitting there waiting for lights to change, those kinds of things. There's a lot of aspects of our transportation network that government just does a really poor job with, not to mention the absurd cost of things. We're paying this transit tax and transportation tax and the bonds and all that stuff, a lot of which was voted on in the November election. And I have to say, I drove north on I-25 today between the Big I and Jefferson. It is a disaster out there. Just the number of potholes and everything that's going on our roads in terms of maintenance. You expect this stuff to be taken care of with all the taxes we're paying and all the bonds we approve, like knee jerk every election. And yet the number of potholes is just absurd. Maybe it has a little bit to do with the recent snowstorms, but I think it's just a lack of attention and government actually doing what the bare bones of what they're supposed to be doing is.
Yeah, and I have noticed that maintenance issue before, and I know enough about roads to know that they certainly take a beating in the winter, but a lot of roads like the on-ramp getting off of I-25 south to Gibson to where you go to the airport, that thing is in the end of the winter condition right now. What's that thing going to look like if we have 3 or 4 more snowstorms? You're going to get those kind of sinkhole-sized potholes that you better watch out. If you have a small fuel-efficient car, you might not come out of that the other side.
Yeah, so coming down the off-ramp onto Coors northbound from I-40 as well, it's I don't know if somebody dumped a whole semi-truck or dump truck of sand and gravel off that road, but it's like they dumped it maybe during the recent snowstorm, or the road's just turning into sand and rocks, and it's just like driving. It actually causes little dust clouds when trucks and whatnot go over it. So government stinks at doing just about everything, even the things that you consider bare bones function of government. We don't have to talk about police and fire and those kinds of issues. We're talking about the roads, my roads, as they say on the memes. But we know that New Mexico has plenty of money to maintain, and we're not even in southeast New Mexico where the roads are really a issue of life and death. But the state of New Mexico has issued its latest budget information. We know that the surplus is magnificent. It is beautiful, in the immortal words of our president. $7.882 billion. That is quite a jump from the end of the Martinez administration. When she left office, we were at a mere $6.3 billion. So we're talking $1.5 billion additional general fund revenue over the last 2 years, 2 budget cycles, we'll say. And we're going to find out what the legislators and the governor are going to do with that money. But boy, that's right about on target. I had estimated in my own shorthand $8 billion. They say it's a slight decrease over where they expect it to be due to a slight decline in production. But boy, the amount of decline in production, I should say, relative to where they expected things to be. But this state is doing amazingly well in terms of revenue generation. It's just a matter of how much spending is going to go on and what's going to happen as a result of that spending.
Yeah, and the fact that when the estimate is down to a mere $797 million of new money, only 0.8 billion, still a awful lot of money for them to take care of. And yeah, it's one of those, when you're talking about now these estimates going forward, I'm not talking about wastefulness of $100 billion or $200 billion. That's not what I'm talking about. But when you're trying to estimate what the total revenue is, that total revenue number is going to be very sensitive to things like the oil price and oil production and other factors. And so, yeah, it's pretty easy to be off a little bit. And that's why historically there's been at least some lip service, if now not outright service, to the idea of let's be conservative. Let's not always take our estimates to the limit one more time. Let's have a little bit of a cushion in there in case things don't happen, because you're making these estimates for a budget that doesn't start, a minimum of like 6 months, 7 months from today. So, you're, what was it Yogi Berra said? The problem with estimates are they're about the future, something to that effect. So, there's things that happen, but the point is there will be lots of money. There will be lots of new money. And then how are we going to spend it? Will it move the state's economy and quality of life forward, or will it be more of the same?
Yeah. And I found the exact estimate. It's in the Santa Fe New Mexican article. State lowers revenue estimate from oil production in FY 2021. Seems like a bit of a bias there in the headline writing, but the article is excellent by Jens Erik Gould. Don't think he is from around these parts, but he is the reporter now from the New Mexican. Steve Terrell went off into the sunset, and they've lost a few of their other reporters. So Mr. Gould is now reporting on politics for the New Mexican, and he cites the state is estimating 360 million barrels of oil in the next fiscal year, down from 400 million barrels. So not too shabby considering we've doubled since 2014 alone. These are the best of times for New Mexico in terms of oil production, and unfortunately, policy in Santa Fe is not particularly well. It's not doing well from a public policy standpoint. It's pretty much the oil just supporting otherwise lousy policy out of Santa Fe.
Yeah, it is the bright spot of our economy without a doubt. Yeah, and to the point where the, I guess, second most touted one is one that is fraught with controversy. Not on this podcast. It's pretty straightforward, the opinion on this podcast. But the number 2 celebrated industry would be the film industry, and we know how we're getting that. The big question is, in some people's minds, is it worth it? I think, Paul, you've been pretty clear. I think your analysis has been pretty clear. Not necessarily worth it, but that's something that a lot of people have hitched their wagon to, so to speak, and they're riding that one hard as the savior industry, the savior clean industry for New Mexico going forward.
Yeah, and as we said previously on this podcast, as long as oil is doing really well, they'll have the money to blow on the film industry. So the fracking supported Hollywood, I think there is some good PR to be mined there by hoisting the liberal Hollywood folks on their own petard. But I think we've seen very clearly that the left doesn't really care about a lot of these things until it actually affects them directly. They don't see the direct effect at this point. The government launders the money from the oil and gas industry before it gets to the film industry, and it all comes out clean on the other side.
Yeah, it's like a sewage treatment plant. You know what goes in the front end, and clean water comes out the back. Yes, it does remind me. It's a good analogy. The money is laundered. It's cleaned up, sparkly clean for them to spend. Guilt-free.
We are certainly not comparing the oil and gas revenue money coming in as sewage. That is not what we would say at all. I would say that they make their money cleanly by honestly bringing that money out of the ground, that product out of the ground, and selling it on the open market, whereas the film industry takes their money from wherever they can get it. They are glad to take in those tax dollars all over the country.
Yeah, they are.
States.
They know no political position, no creed, no. They're loyal to whoever will write them a check.
They did step up against Georgia, and I believe it had to do with an abortion law. So,
okay, there you go.
They left abortion.
Okay.
Heaven forbid you put a restriction on some abortion issue, and that'll get them going in the film industry. But other than that, they will gladly take the money from whence it came. All right, speaking of money and subsidies and an institution that we love to critique, UNM, in this case, their development arm, they are attempting to sell some land, which we applaud, and we've talked about this a little bit, but the UNM South campus is considered underdeveloped. Now, it's home to a BMX bike track. It is home to Isotopes Park. It is home to the UNM Lobo football stadium, as well as the pit.
Some new housing developments in the last several years have gone up in that area.
So there are UNM land holdings in that area that they are considering selling for developers, which is not just something that we were okay with. We encourage that kind of behavior because that takes money out of the morass, the pit that is UNM, a tax-funded entity, and puts it into productive use and tax-paying use. So theoretically, more taxes flowing in from the private sector should have some power to reduce taxes on the rest of us, although they manage to spend whatever comes into them. That's the way the politicians tend to work. But tax increment financing, it's a little bit of a complicated scheme, but we've talked about it in the past. Basically, it takes whatever the property is valued at now, so the worth of it now, and then you allow it to be developed, or it's developed, and the developer takes that increment between where the property is valued at now and its future value after it's been developed. And how much of that value is taken by the developer and what it's used for, et cetera, is open to discussion and debate. But it's a very controversial policy that's been done across the country. And unfortunately, New Mexico started to do it, on the order of a decade ago. And the question I have is, it's supposed to be used for blighted areas, poor economically destitute areas that need to be redeveloped. I would not call South Campus at UNM especially blighted. There's some older housing, but would you call that blighted, Wally?
Well, the pit is they've done their redo. It's beautiful from the outside, setting aside for a minute any of the functionality things that have been involved with that, Isotope Stadium, even the football. I don't believe that's a blighted area. So
yeah, and of course UNM owns this land, so theoretically it's off the taxpayer rolls right now. Not theoretically, very likely it's currently valued at zero, at least assessed for zero. So how much of this increment is going to the developer? Where is this money going? It's an issue that's going to be debated and discussed at Albuquerque City Council. So folks, this is an issue that's a little bit more complicated than the average tax and spending issue, but it is definitely worth people looking at and considering. What I'm going to say is that it's an issue of UNM trying to drive a good bargain for whatever developer that they are going to sell this land to get a higher price, more money for the university. And this is all going to come at the expense of taxpayers, especially property taxpayers around the city and around the county, whoever gets into this mix. It is TIDs are big in some cities like Chicago, and they ultimately become money sucks. They're like leeches, where you have the existing area that's not receiving a TID, normally unconnected average folks who are paying property taxes the full rate, but their property taxes are being diverted in dribs and drabs to these other developers who are taking home a lot of this money. And it's one of those somewhat rare issues where you get some agreement on the left and right on this corporate welfare kind of issue. But watch out, folks. This one seems like a doozy.
Yeah, and just if I understand this right, Paul, a TID or a TIF, tax increment financing, they basically put a property tax, but they designate it to go directly back into that project. So it's a lot like what people in Southeast New Mexico said, hey, we're producing all this revenue for the state. How about you put some of it back into us directly? Or and the legislators, many of them, well, no, that's not how that works. So it's one of those, it's a kind of a selective conceptual application of things. And, you could see how it would work maybe for a blighted area. But I mean, the history of these, to the extent I've looked at it, they're used for things that are not necessarily as much of taking a bad neighborhood and turning it into a new as back to another version of, dare I say it again on the podcast, some sort of a corporate welfare to help the developer get rich, build large high-rise hotels, other things like that. So
yeah, I guess the way I would look at it, and that's a correct assessment in my estimation, but say you live in a world without government, just put your mind into it, but you have a neighborhood association. In fact, you have one neighborhood association in one area, and they pay for the policing and the roads, et cetera. And then you have a new development. So development B comes along, and now the original neighborhood association is still paying for the police and the roads for both now, but the tax dollars, or at least a significant component of those tax dollars from the new subdivision, are being dedicated to only pay for goods in that subdivision. Right. Now, I could certainly see a world, and we just talked about the incompetence of government when it comes to building basic infrastructure and roads. I could see a world where everyone lives in some kind of homeowners association equivalent, where it's a private organization that builds the roads, maintains the infrastructure, and hires the police, et cetera, et cetera. But where you get into a problem is that when you have government still in place, diverting resources from original developers in developments into a second development that is then able to capture all or most of the revenue generated by that particular area. So that is an apt description and an apt way to, I think, use that thought experiment. It is a complicated issue, and I've talked to several folks who live, especially in that UNM area, who are up in arms about the use of this tax increment development district. And it's really only a name differential, TIDD versus TIF. You can read articles from all over the country about TIF, tax increment financing. Chicago is kind of one of the worst of the worst examples of the abuse of this. But Randall O'Toole, a great transportation expert at the Cato Institute, and others, he's independent, but he does a lot of writing at Cato. He's written a great brief about TIF, tax increment financing, and there's a lot of great information. Again, left, right, and center economists really have a big problem with that, and in this case, it's definitely something that could be a real problem. Wally, on the issue of, again, sticking with higher education, but going up to the Four Corners, and San Juan Community College has voted, the faculty have, to unionize. That's an interesting development for a variety of reasons. This article is from the Santa Fe New Mexican, interestingly enough, but the Daily Times reported, Farmington Daily Times, that 87 out of the 147 full-time faculty members at San Juan College have voted in favor of unionization. So overwhelming support there in a, unlike UNM, which I think vote that we would expect is whether the faculty should join the Communist Party or not at UNM. All due respect to the folks at UNM. Yes.
And the Communist Party.
Yeah. If you read a UNM byline in the Albuquerque Journal, you can almost guarantee that it is going to be calling for massive government expansion or some kind of other left-wing agenda item. However, Farmington is a different ball of wax entirely, much more conservative area. Even at the community college, those people are involved in their community, and there's a school of energy up there that's at least a significant component of what that entire place does. So you expect a little more conservative outcome. But once again, in a post-Janus world, Janus versus ASME, guaranteeing public employees the right to work, so they don't have to join the union or pay union dues. So the faculty, the 41 members who voted against it, will not have to join or pay union dues for the other folks involved in this new union at San Juan College. But before I hand it over to you for comment, Wally, I will say that when the Rio Grande Foundation has done salary requests for various institutions around our state, whether it's counties or cities or higher education or school districts, I think the single one that gets most people ginned up is San Juan College. They have had rampant management issues at San Juan College for years and years. I get people calling, I can't request this information because if I request this information from the college, there will be retribution. They will know that I'm requesting salary data for the higher up muckety mucks, et cetera, et cetera. So I've heard repeatedly of mismanagement problems at San Juan College. And it's not a surprise to me that this was, as far as I know, the second institution of higher learning in the state to go union.
Well, at a minimum, you would have to say that the rank and file faculty members would say that the current approach to management faculty relations is strained enough to where they say, what we're doing now isn't working. Let's go another direction. Now, will they be happy with that? Because, man, union contracts bring a lot of complexity and a lot of rules that end up being very problematic for both sides in most cases. But yes, if nothing else, it would be a very strong indication of frustration by the faculty members, because that's a pretty good percentage of them voted to do it, over 2-to-1 margin.
I don't want to put you on the spot, Wally, but you do a lot of work up in the Four Corners area. Have you heard anything in your dealings with folks up there about goings on at the community college? Or
no, and I was thinking about that. I actually have not. Now, I know there's been a lot of turnover, some people even at the School of Energy, but it didn't strike me at the time. It always seemed like the people that were moving on were moving to something, not just running away from a sinking ship. But again, I deal with people up there as a very narrow slice of what's going on at that college. And yeah, I was pretty surprised to see this, frankly.
Well, at the Rio Grande Foundation, as you might imagine, when people have a problem with government,
who are you going to call?
Yes, we don't show up in our old style ambulance with flashing lights and whatever lasers or whatever the Ghostbusters had. But yeah, we tend to attract a lot of folks who are disenchanted with government, especially since we have often collected salary information for government structures, government bodies all over the state of New Mexico, including community colleges and colleges as a whole. So,
yep.
Another one that has its share of management issues and has plenty of unions involved. We were just doing some casual poking around the latest APS, Albuquerque Public Schools budget. The 2020 budget is available. So this is looking forward into next year and beyond. So starting fall and going ahead, the estimates are that the APS budget will be $1.475 billion with a B, billion dollars.
Almost $1.5 billion.
Almost $1.5 billion. Wow. All the while, the student population at APS continues to plummet at 79,000 students estimated. You do the math on that, and I'll do it for you, Wally.
All right, very good.
$18,680 per student. APS is, in many ways, swimming in money. Now, does this mean that our children, my children, are getting a particularly wonderful education at APS? Nothing of the sort. It simply means that APS has a boatload of cash right now.
Yes, and just clicking on the link to their budget, when you talk about the complexity necessary to manage such a massive school district as Albuquerque Public Schools, the budget document itself is 502 pages long. So, there are plenty of people that argue that school districts get to the point where they are not enhanced, their effectiveness is not enhanced by becoming ever larger and larger and larger. And the fact is that if you're going to find out exactly what's going on in the budget, you better pack a lunch, because you're not just going to get through that document very quickly in terms of figuring out where any of the skeletons might be buried with regard to that 502-page document.
Well, you're probably not going to find many skeletons in there, because after all, APS does write the budget themselves, and there are plenty of skeletons at APS that you're not going to find in the budget document. But it is, I will say, as somebody who, when it comes to government, would definitely like more information than less information, APS does a job that's much better than any school district around the state in terms of actually providing real information and data, warts and all, about its challenges, including the drop in enrollment. So I'm reading this directly from the APS budget document, page 44, I believe. And under the header enrollment, it says, over the last 7 years, the district's enrollment has dropped an average 1,000 students per year. So that is a significant decrease. When fiscal year 2014, that was the year, 86.7 thousand, 86,700. And now fiscal year 20, so going on a fiscal year basis, 79,400 students. Now, it is worth noting that birth rates, and we've seen birth rates nationwide declining significantly. We've also seen populations stagnate, especially among people with children here. We're seeing more retirees and older folks coming and less people, partially, I believe, due to the education quality or lack thereof that New Mexico has offered in recent years, that people with children are a little bit leery of coming here. Don't throw the crime in, and you have a lot of reasons for people with children or expecting to start a family to not show up in the city of Albuquerque or New Mexico in general. But if the case is that we're seeing student declines, the population declines, should we not also see a budget decline, or at least some constraint in the budget? We're just seeing this per pupil expenditure grow and grow and grow and grow.
Yeah, and large government organizations are very challenged by two things. And I go back and forth on which I think they have a harder time adjusting to. One is change, and two is shrinking. And in this case, APS is being asked to make changes to try to increase educational attainment. At the same time, the overall size of the district is going down, and those two factors together are not easily addressed by any bureaucracy, much less one that's as large as APS.
All right, and we have now hit the final topic, which is the governor and the legislature are considering a new airplane. Of course, folks who have been involved in or followed New Mexico politics for a while remember when Bill Richardson had a fancy jet, and that was sold under Governor Martinez. But the Lujan Grisham and the legislature are considering a Beechcraft King Air C90 GTX. Boy, they really add on those acronym names there.
When only the best will do.
Yes. It is a turboprop, so we're not talking about a jet.
Yeah, it's not the Lear or similar.
It's $2.5 to $4 million new. And look, you can make the argument both ways that the governor should or should not be flying around in a more efficient airplane is going to get her around to Hobbs and Farmington and Las Cruces more efficiently, certainly, than would driving. But what we looked at, Wally, and this is where it gets really fun, the governor is demanding soon that we all get 52 miles to the gallon. Now, her SUV, a Ford Expedition, gets between 16 and 21 miles to the gallon. So she has a ways to go. I strongly think that regardless of the plane conversation, the governor needs to up her game to an electric vehicle to get around the state. That's certainly, let's see 52 miles to the gallon, Madam Governor.
Yeah,
and how
at least a hybrid.
Yeah, how you enjoy hanging out at a charging station in the middle of nowhere when you need...
Or a charging station that isn't in the middle of nowhere and waiting for the tow truck to pull you to a charging station.
Exactly, yeah. You probably won't find a charging station between Albuquerque and Hobbs. But we did the numbers because, of course, aircraft, they're measured in knots, nautical miles.
Right.
And you have to make a calculation, and you have to calculate, a plane flying, how many gallons of fuel do they use per hour and calculate the miles. We looked at it, and 6.39 miles to the gallon is what this lovely Beechcraft aircraft would be getting, which is probably better than some of the alternatives. They say it's a real fuel sipper. At the website I looked at, the Airline Pilots Association, AOPA.org, they have a full description of the aircraft in question. But, when she's talking about us getting 52 miles to the gallon, which is, I think, completely unrealistic, what is the governor even doing considering a fuel guzzling airplane?
Yeah, and it comes down to what's interesting is where this is such a dangerous political issue for someone like the governor or anyone who goes along this line is, well, it makes sense for me because I'm an important executive and my time is important. So therefore, using a little more fuel is good for the state of New Mexico. Okay, fine. I could actually accept that to a certain level. Now, just take that same phrase and put in, I am an important executive that work for a company or my own company, and my time is valuable, so I ought to have these opportunities as well. So the key is that if it's good for the governor, and maybe it is, these options ought to be good for everyone, or at least have the opportunity to do it in a free market society. So that's the one aspect. The other is, guess what happened when Governor Richardson didn't have his airplane available for him? His entourage would get clocked going 120 and 140 miles per hour. And I saw on a political commentator who posts Monday through Thursday, enough said with that, you can probably guess who it is, said that one of the good things that the governor did in her first year in office was she wasn't busted by a sheriff in a rural county going over 100 miles per gallon. Are you talking
about Martinez or this current governor?
No, the current governor was not clocked going 100, 120, 140. So to the extent she's driving around the state, she either one of two things, either hasn't been busted, hasn't been caught, or actually might be keeping it somewhat close to the speed limit.
Well, there you go. The website in question that does the full analysis of the Beechcraft King Air 350 is the AOPA.org. Quick look, Beechcraft King Air 350 filler up. And it's a good article. It has a lot of the particulars about this particular plane model, and that's where I got my calculations that found, yes, the governor, 6.9 miles an hour, miles per gallon, I should say, essentially. 6.39 miles to the gallon. Not quite going to get her up to the level that she's going to expect for the rest of us. And this is at a time, by the way, when the state is purchasing hybrid and electric vehicles for the rest of the employees. So we might even get some allies here on the side
on the green side.
Yeah, on the government worker side who, nothing's going to be more inefficient than government employees waiting around at charging stations. Oops, I'm stuck here in the middle of nowhere. I don't have cell phone service. I have nothing. I'm just going to sit here and try to do my due diligence, do my work as a government employee while I wait for this lovely electric vehicle to charge. But,
yeah.
Fun stuff. Look for more on this. I hope that the media will at least get some interest in that kind of blatant hypocrisy, and that's exactly what it is. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.